Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to be discussing some research. It's a collaboration between Texas Parks and Wildlife and us at the Cesar Claiborne Wildlife Research Institute, looking at how the limitation of dietary energy can influence the growth and antler size of white-tailed deer. And so us as wildlife managers or researchers have always been interested in why animals are different sizes and where. And so we come up with a lot of ecological theories or general guidelines or rules that we can follow. So for instance, there's Bergman's rule, where as a species is further northward throughout their geographical range, they tend to be larger in body size. However, there tends to be rule breakers. So for instance, some of my dissertation research is looking at mule deer in the Texas Panhandle, an area that has a lot of agriculture and can produce individuals up to 320 pounds. And if we flip over to white-tailed deer, we know that geographically they're doing great. They're expanding northward, they're expanding westward, and they're occupying a diverse array of different habitat types and geographical areas. And we also know that throughout the range, they tend to be larger in some areas and smaller in others. And that even occurs in Texas, where we have a wide array of ecological regions or different habitat types. We've got whitetail through a lot of them, and they tend to be different sizes in terms of antlers or body size, etc. And so I want to talk about a specific study that was done a little over a decade ago. And it was done by Monteith et al. In South Dakota. And so South Dakota on the east side has a lot of agriculture, and there's larger deer there in terms of body size and antlers. Whereas the Black Hills, that region on the left here, it's a little bit darker green, also has a whitetail occupying it, but they tend to be smaller in body size and smaller in antler size as well. So you got these two populations. One tends to be larger in the east and one smaller in the west. And it's likely because of the available nutrition throughout their habitat. And so here I've got that indicated by the salad next to the Black Hills deer and the Big Mac next to the East South Dakota deer. And so what these researchers did is they went out in these areas and they captured fawns essentially at birth, newborn fawns, brought them into captivity and put them under the same diet, which would be indicated by the Big Mac, a good diet for deer in a captive setting. And they followed them throughout life. They allowed them to grow up and they measured them annually. And what they found was, even though these newborn fawns were brought into captivity and given the exact same food, allowed to eat as much as they wanted of it, those that came from the smaller population were smaller in size. They then allowed those to reproduce and followed their offspring and found that they essentially leveled out during that second generation. The Black Hills second generation was actually a little bit smaller, but overall it began to improve. And so what this showed was it actually takes generations to overcome what they called a maternal effect. Essentially, the body condition or how healthy or big your mother was influences you directly, and then your offspring somewhat so beyond that. They also, within the same study, looked at antler size and found the exact same pattern. Those first generation bucks from the Black Hills, even under great nutrition, had smaller antlers compared to those from eastern South Dakota. Whereas the second generation, they began to catch up. And so that brings us to what are causing these geographical differences that we see in body size and antler size. And so there's been a lot of postulation or studies that have looked at how soil can influence it, general nutrition, protein levels, energy, fiber, etc., density of deer, land use practices, rainfall, or maybe lagging maternal effects like we just demonstrated. And so that brings us to our study done at the Kerr Wildlife Management Area, specifically within their captive white-tailed deer research facility, where they have several rearing pens, breeding pens, and the ability to split individuals into various areas to be excluded from one another and individually process these deer. And our overall thought was, okay, if we take deer from different areas, or they're different sizes, we give them food, and then they can reach kind of a common maximum, eventually through generations can make up for it. What if we do it backwards? What if we flip it around to where we've got this group of deer that are all the same, and we split those individuals and say, okay, you can continue eating this standard diet, but we're going to reduce your diet here to see if we can essentially have the reverse effect. And then, follow them through time and weigh them through time or measure them through time to see at what age classes this may come into play. In addition, it'd be important to, on the reduced diet, let them eat as much as they want. And so we produced two different diets. And so they're both the exact same in terms of protein level, vitamins, minerals. They were exact same diet between the two. The only thing that differed is the digestible energy between them. And so we had our standard energy diet, which is at 2.8 kilocalories per gram, which is very standard for most feeds. However, the low energy diet was below 2.2 kilocalories per gram, which is drastically reduced compared to a standard white-tailed deer diet. And so what we did is we raised 3 different cohorts that totaled 309 deer. And so as these fawns entered the study, they were randomly assigned diets or treatments. So one would go to standard energy diet, one would go to a low energy diet. They would remain on that diet through 5 years old. And we would collect annually their overall weight, total body condition, total body length, body condition, and Boone and Crockett score. And so throughout that first year, here we see the overall feed disappearance. So how much they're eating between the low energy diet in purple and the green standard energy diet. And these colors are going to remain the same for the rest of the presentation. And so here you can see that every month for the first year of life for all of these cohorts of deer, you can see that low energy diet is trying to make up for what they've lost essentially by consuming more food. And so switching over to our results for the weight, here on the x-axis we have age, y-axis weight, purple is low energy, green is standard energy, and the blue numbers are the difference between the treatments within each age class. And you can see that overall bucks get heavier throughout their age generally until they plateau at maturity. You can also see that the low energy diet had drastically lower weights, upwards of 30 to 40 pounds difference between the treatments. Moving over to the females, we can see throughout the ages, we see a similar pattern, however, not as drastic of a difference, around that 8 to 10 pound difference between these treatments through time. Switching to body length, a structural measurement, we see a similar pattern. Those on the low energy diet were smaller compared to those on a standard diet. Also interesting to see that the largest disparity is at early ages for bucks, which we'll get to later. Moving to females, we see that not as much of a difference, but still a similar pattern. In all cases, the low energy diet was lesser than the standard energy diet. And again, I just want to point out for body length, these differences may not seem like a lot, only 2 to 3 inches. However, if you extrapolate that to the overall skeletal or musculature structure of a deer, it actually turns out to be quite a bit larger of a deer compared to others in terms of 3 inches difference in body length. So now moving on to body condition, which is a score between 1 and 5 that we give based on the amount of body fat that they have. You can see for bucks throughout all age classes, they had larger body conditions, upwards of about 1 score better. Moving over to females, you see a similar pattern at 1 and 2 years old. However, you'll see that at 3, 4, and 5, yes, the lower energy diet was lesser than the standard energy diet. However, the difference is not as much, which we'll also get to in a bit. Lastly, my favorite topic is antler size. Here at 1 year old, you see that we have 22 inches difference of Boone and Crockett score between the standard energy diet and the low energy diet. Moving on to 2 year olds, we see a 26-inch difference, a 25-inch difference at 3, an 18-inch difference at 4, and a 19-inch difference at 5 years old. And so at some of those age classes, that is 2 feet of 2 feet of difference in terms of antler size between those different treatments, just within a couple of years of age. And since we're talking about Big Macs and salads and whatnot, that equates to $10 of Subway $5 footlongs of antler size just between those 2 different treatments. And so if we think about how digestible energy might be influencing antler size, you can imagine that there's a buck entering the summer where he's got to grow some antlers. There's a standard amount of energy on the landscape. And so the buck moves about the landscape foraging, it gets the amount of energy it needs, and it meets what it was supposed to do that year. It had a standard amount available, it produced what the standard was, whatever his potential was that given year, that's what he's likely to produce. However, in a year where there's not as much digestible energy on the landscape, there could be, for that given year, a temporary reduction in antler size, a bad year for antlers for that individual in that particular year. And so, for a lot of, especially South Texas, that might make you think, well, what if I supplementally feed? And we know that a lot of times that buffers populations against a lot of external factors that may influence survival or antler growth, et cetera. But it's important to keep in mind that not all deer eat feed when it's available, and not all of, say, a buck's diet is feed. And so they're eating a lot of native vegetation, so they're reliant on the digestible energy that's available to them. And so if there was a couple rough years where there was lower digestible energy on the landscape, a sustainability of that low energy would actually have a bad influence on that overall buck's potential, probably throughout their life, similar to our study. And so now when we start comparing the difference between males and females, we saw a greater difference between the treatments, the standard and low energy diets for males compared to the females. However, that might simply be because males are larger than females. And so there'd be likely be a greater difference between the treatments, or it could be reproductive constraints. And so if you remember, overall body weight, size, and body condition of females was not as different at 3, 4, and 5 years old. That's because they were allowed to reproduce. They were allowed to raise fawns during that time. And a lot of times females, whatever nutrients they're acquiring during that time, they're allocating to their young through lactation instead of building up structurally or body size or body fat, et cetera. And so it's also interesting to point out the difference between males and females in terms of how they invest structural growth and how they invest accumulating body fat or body condition. So males tend to invest in structural growth early. They want to get big, they want to get strong, they want to compete with other males at younger ages. However, females stop growing structurally sooner because they'll start reproducing within 1 or 2 years of age. However, in terms of body condition or body fat, males will accumulate that later in life, whereas females use it as a currency, kind of like I said, for reproduction, where whatever they are able to acquire, they're then going to put into reproduction in that given year. And so we see these kind of patterns with these data where the females on the top here, you can see that there's a little bit of difference in structural size, the body length early in life. However, after that, no matter what treatment it is, they've essentially plateaued. And that's because they're investing into reproduction. They're no longer growing structurally during that time. Whereas males on the bottom here, you can see that the greatest difference between the treatments is earlier in life, showing that maybe a standard or that low energy diet is limiting the amount of structural growth that they can do early. And then the difference becomes essentially the same after off, plateauing after that. Switching over to weight, we can see that the greatest difference between the treatments for males is actually later in life, when they're likely to be putting on those excess body stores, that body fat, showing that maybe low energy diet is having a negative influence on that. And females, again, we see have essentially plateaued, likely because they're reproducing during that time. However, there is still a difference between the treatments at later ages for females. And so the next thing I'd like to talk about is that deer are selective browsers. And so much of a deer's diet actually has adequate protein levels for maintenance. And if on the landscape there's a low amount of digestible energy, that's likely because the plants that are available for these selective browsers, these deer, are very high in fiber. Now, a deer cannot pass high fiber forage through the rumen as efficiently as other forage sources. And so they have to increase their food intake. They have to start eating more to make up for it, to make up for lost calories, essentially. And so at very low digestible energy or high fiber, they may actually reach a point to where they cannot physically eat enough to maintain or continue growing or gaining nutritional stores throughout time. However, switching over to protein generally, the supply of protein is usually around 10 to 19% annually, whereas a deer's requirements for growth tends to be between 12 and 16%. And so generally speaking, throughout any given time of the year, there's enough protein on the landscape that a deer actually needs for growth. However, digestible energy fluctuates a lot more throughout time. And so, for instance, the supply of digestible energy is indicated in this orange-yellow line here, where you can see a major dip during the early half of the year. So that'd be the summer, when females are producing young and bucks are growing antlers. That's when their demand in green is the highest. And so this disparity between them is likely the limiting factor, the actual nutrient quality or quantity that is limiting those types of things in terms of antler growth or fawn production during that time. And so it's important, I want to just remind you that, again, in our study, the deer on the low energy diet ate more. So it would make you think that, well, just because I'm eating salads, if I eat too many salads in a given day, I can still gain weight and gain size. And it just leads to the question is why these low energy deer do not stop growing. We know that they have the ability to grow structurally, grow in body fat, develop antlers, just like normal deer do throughout the various ecosystems. However, this difference between the treatments stays about the same throughout time. And you would think that if you had the ability to eat as much as you could, that you would eventually, your body would tell you just keep eating until we get to where we're supposed to be. However, that doesn't seem to be the case. There seems to be some kind of physiological switch that happens that tells these deer essentially to stop growing and start maintaining. And so it's interesting to point out that there was a concurrent study where Floyd Weckerly and a couple others looked at the overall rumen weights in these deer at the end of the study. So once they hit 5 years old, they left the study and they measured how heavy their rumen mass was, which is an indication of how much it had to work. What they found is the low energy diet on the left compared to those on the right for males and females, the rumen weight was greater, meaning they were having to work harder, and the actual structure, physical structure of the rumen was changing because of their diet, showing an actual physiological switch of how they're processing foods and how their organs are responding to that. They also, interestingly, found that their molars for the low energy diet were more degraded compared to the standard energy diet, showing that they were having to eat and grind up food much more. And so there seems to be some kind of physiological cue that switches from growth to maintenance for these deer when they're on a low energy diet. And again, just a reminder, these individuals came from the same stock. And so there might be these early nutritional feedbacks that are occurring, where as they begin foraging, there's a feedback within their body, essentially signaling for the body to stop growing structurally or in weight and start maintaining. However, it could be the gut indicating that kind of feedback, where as that morphology changes, that indicates how their body size can be. But nonetheless, these low energy diet, especially over time, is causing these lifelong body size or morphology limitations for these deer. And so lastly, I want to talk about kind of the next phase of this project. We've got these two different treatments, and we're wondering, yes, their body size in terms of weight and structure and their antler size are all smaller, but what's most important about a deer population or individual fitness is, can they reproduce? And so we allowed those does to reproduce again, and their fawns for the standard energy diet, they had about a 1.5 fawns per doe or 0.8 twinning rate for those does in that treatment, and birth weights of about 5.5 pounds for either sex. And so looking at the low energy diet, those deer that are reduced in body size and body condition and all of that, you would expect that reproduction would then take a hit. However, the numbers are almost identical, showing that these deer, there's some kind of physiological switch telling them to stop growing and to start reproducing or maintaining. And so overall, dietary energy is likely the limiting factor, especially for antlers and body weight. And this limitation in energy, especially over generations, could produce smaller sized deer in a given population within years, like a cohort effect, or throughout years, like the maternal effect. And there's a lot of focus on protein supplementation for deer, and a lot of that is a carryover from livestock. And so grazers tend to have lower protein diets, and they also digest fiber a lot better than browsers. And so grazers are likely to respond from supplemented protein more so than browsers. And browsers are more likely to be limited by energy because they can't digest these fibrous materials. And these protein pellets that we're giving deer actually already have a good amount of energy within them. That's likely indicating these benefits that we see from protein supplementation. And again, I just want to, as an aside, we didn't develop a better feed. We actually did the opposite. We created a really, really rough food in terms of dietary energy to try to understand what actual specific limiting factors are occurring for deer within their environment. And also starting to demonstrate the link between the nutrients or nutrient qualities and quantities that they're ingesting and actual physiological cues that are indicating body size. And lastly, I think it's important to consider the amount, the timing, and the generational effects that dietary energy can have on a deer population. And so with that, I would like to acknowledge all of the TPWD and WMA staff that helped with processing deer throughout this long-term study and the numerous volunteers. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions. Thank you.